The Japanese soldiers were no longer shadows in the jungle. They were a moving wall of bodies rushing across the Black's end of Alligator Creek. Bayonets fixed, voices merging into one terrifying roar. For an entire year, that sound had meant defeat. Across China, across the Philippines, across the early battles of the Pacific, the Banzai charge had become more than a tactic. It had become a weapon of the mind. American soldiers had heard the stories. 8,000 men charging without fear. A human wave that could absorb bullets and keep moving. An enemy that believed death was not a reason to stop. But on this night, August 21, 1942, on a forgotten strip of sand at the mouth of a jungle creek on Guadalcanal, that myth was about to meet something it had never faced before. A small American anti-Midas tank gun, a weapon designed to destroy machines, now loaded with a shell designed to destroy men. Inside that shell were 122 steel balls, and 3 exhausted Marines were waiting for the exact moment to unleash them. The question was simple. Could 3 men stop nearly 1,000? The rain had stopped an hour before midnight, but the jungle was still alive with water. Drops fell from massive leaves onto steel helmets. Mud clung to boots. The air smelled of salt water, rotting vegetation, and the sweat of men who had spent weeks fighting on an island where nothing ever truly dried. Along the western bank of Alligator Creek, a thin line of Marines waited in darkness. They were tired. They were young, and many of them were about to experience something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Captain John Hightower crouched behind a low defensive ridge. He was 31 years old, a Marine artillery officer from Tennessee. He was not famous. He was not a legendary commander. At that moment, he was simply a man responsible for keeping a fragile line from breaking. And somewhere beyond the darkness in front of him, hundreds of enemy soldiers were preparing to attack. The jungle had gone silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Hightower understood what that meant. The enemy was close, very close. Beside him sat the reason he believed they might survive the night, a 37-man T-tank gun. The weapon had been built to destroy Japanese armored vehicles. But on Guadalcanal, there were few Japanese tanks. There was only jungle, mud. War had changed faster than the manuals could keep up with. Sergeant Eddie McCullough understood that better than anyone. He knelt beside the gun, checking the mechanism again, then again. His hands moved automatically. The metal was familiar. The routine was familiar. That was how he controlled fear. Not with speeches, not with confidence, with preparation. McCullough had been an artillery instructor before the war. He knew exactly what the gun could do, and he knew exactly what the strange ammunition loaded inside it could do. It was not an armor-piercing shell. It was a canister round. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Inside was something much more primitive, something that belonged to another century. A metal container packed tightly with steel balls. When fired, the shell would burst open after leaving the barrel, spreading those steel projectiles outward in a deadly cone. A shotgun shell the size of a human arm, a weapon built to kill tanks, turned into a weapon meant for a human wave. Private Miller sat nearby, ready to reload. He was barely 20 years old. He had practiced the loading sequence so many times that his hands could perform it without thought. Open the breech, remove the spent shell, insert the next round, close, fire again, again, again. He did not think about what the steel balls would do. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking slowed you down. 3 men, 1 gun, 8th in defensive line, against an entire Japanese assault force. 2 miles away, Colonel Kiyomi Oichiki made the decision that would determine the fate of his entire command. Oichiki was not an incompetent officer. He was a veteran, a professional soldier. He had seen Japanese forces defeat enemies who seemed stronger. He believed in discipline. He believed in offensive spirit. And most importantly, he believed he understood the Americans. That belief would destroy him. His mission was to retake Henderson Field. the airfield captured by American Marines on Guadalcanal. His detachment numbered around 900 men. His orders were clear. Wait, gather more forces, bring up supporting weapons, attack with overwhelming strength. But Aichiki looked at the situation differently. Waiting felt like weakness. The Americans, he believed, were inexperienced. They had not faced the kind of attack Japanese soldiers could deliver. A sudden night assault, a violent charge, a collapse of enemy morale. That was how victories had been won before. So he made his choice. He attacked early, with fewer men, against an enemy he underestimated. His soldiers prepared in the darkness, bayonets attached, faces covered with charcoal, weapons checked. They moved forward, believing the night belonged to them. They had no idea what waited across the creek. Back on the American side, Hightower gave the order, "Hold your fire." The message moved quietly along the line. No one fired. No one moved. The Marines could hear the enemy approaching. The sound grew louder. A low rumble, then voices, hundreds of voices. The Japanese soldiers began to emerge from the jungle. At first, they were only shapes, then figures, then an entire mass of men moving across the sand. They were no longer hiding. They did not need to. They believed they had already won. The Marines watched them come closer. Every instinct told them to fire. Machine guns wanted to open. Rifles wanted to crack. But Hightower waited, because he understood something important. The canister round was not meant for distance. It needed concentration. It needed the enemy packed together. It needed the perfect moment. And now that moment was approaching. The Japanese soldiers crossed onto the sandbar. 200 yards. 150. The bayonets reflected faintly under the moonlight. The shouting became louder, almost impossible to separate into individual voices. Just one massive sound. Fear moved in both directions. The Japanese soldiers feared nothing in front of them. The Marines feared what would happen if they failed. Nicolau stared through the gun sight. His entire world became a narrow line of metal and darkness. He had imagined this moment before, during training, during preparation. But imagination was different. Imagination did not have faces. 120 yards. That was the range. The sandbar had become exactly what he needed. A funnel. A killing zone. Hightower watched the charging soldiers. He saw their faces now. Young men. Angry men. Terrified men. Men who believed they were running toward victory. He knew they were running toward something else. His hand tightened. Then he spoke. Fire. Nicolau pulled the trigger. The 37 gun exploded into the darkness. The recoil slammed backward. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the entire battlefield, and for a fraction of a second, everyone could see what was happening. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging forward, straight into the path of 122 steel balls traveling at incredible speed. The canister shell burst. The center of the Japanese formation disappeared. Not slowed, not pushed back. Destroyed. A gap opened in the charging line, then fell where they ran. The momentum of the attack carried some bodies forward even after they were already dead. For 1 second, the Japanese soldiers behind them did not understand. They had never seen anything like it. The attack that was supposed to overwhelm the Americans had been stopped by a weapon they had never expected. But the battle was not over, because the Banzai charge was not built on logic. It was built on belief, and belief could keep men moving even after reality had changed. Nicolau was already preparing the second. The empty shelf fell away. Miller loaded the next. No hesitation, no discussion, just training. The gun fired again. Another wave of steel crossed the sand. Another section of the charge collapsed. Now the entire American line opened. Machine guns, rifles, mortars. The darkness filled with flashes. The Japanese soldiers kept coming. And that was the terrifying part. They kept coming, even through the bodies of their own men. Even through the storm of bullets. Because the Japanese soldiers were not cowards. They were brave. They were disciplined. They were fighting according to everything they had been taught. But bravery alone could not defeat a weapon designed for the exact moment they had created. The battlefield had become a collision between two ideas. One side believed courage could overcome firepower. The other had discovered that imagination could transform firepower into something far more powerful. And on the Black's end of Guadalcanal, that difference would decide the night. The first breakthrough almost happened. Almost. On the right side of the Marine position, the Japanese found a weakness. The terrain dipped lower there. The anti-mine gun could not cover every angle. And in the confusion of darkness, a group of Japanese soldiers slipped through. For a moment, the battle changed completely. The carefully planned defense disappeared. There were no more clean lines, no more perfect ranges, no more controlled firing. The fight became what every soldier feared most: close combat, men fighting in mud, hands grabbing uniforms, bayonets flashing in the dark, rifles used as clubs. The Japanese had wanted this moment. This was the battlefield they believed they could win. Once they reached the American line, technology would matter less. A rifleman with a bayonet could fight a machine gunner. A determined soldier could defeat a stronger enemy. That was the theory, and for a few minutes, it seemed possible. Captain Hightower heard the change immediately. The sound was different. The distant crack of gunfire had become something much more brutal. The sound of men fighting face to face. He had a choice. Turn the 37 gun toward the breach. Protect his own men, or keep firing into the main Japanese assault still crossing the sandbar. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life, because either choice meant accepting that someone would die. If he turned the gun, the hundreds of Japanese soldiers crossing the sandbar might reach the defensive line. If he stayed where he was, the Marines fighting in the breach would have to survive without him. There was no perfect answer. Only the answer that gave everyone else the best chance. Hightower kept the gun pointed forward. He trusted the Marines in the breach, and he kept feeding the enemy into the killing zone. Mikolau fired again, and again. The barrel of the gun grew hotter. The metal began to glow faintly. The weapon was being pushed beyond what it was designed to endure. But there was no time to stop, no time to let it cool. The gun had become the center of the entire battlefield. Every Japanese soldier moving across the sandbar was drawn toward it. Every Marine on the ridge understood the same thing. If that gun stopped firing, the night could change in minutes. And then came the fear beneath all the others. Ammunition. The gun was powerful, but it was not unlimited. The Marines had only a limited supply of canister rounds. Every shell was a few seconds of survival. Every shot was another chance, and every empty ammunition box brought the Japanese closer. Miller kept loading. His hands moved faster than his thoughts. The war around him became a blur. He did not see the battlefield anymore. He saw only the breach, the shell, the movement, the rhythm. That was how men survived moments too terrible to understand. They reduced the impossible into small tasks. One round, one shot, one more second. Across the battlefield, Colonel Ichiki began to understand the disaster unfolding. The reports coming back were confused. Units were not advancing. Officers were not answering. The attack that was supposed to destroy the American line had stopped moving. Not because the Americans had broken, because they had adapted. Ichiki had expected determination. He had expected resistance, but he had not expected this. A weapon turned into something completely different. A defensive position transformed into a trap. A handful of Marines refusing to panic. The attack had not failed because his men lacked courage. It failed because courage had collided with preparation, and preparation had won. Back on the sandbar, another Japanese wave formed. Even after everything they had seen, they came again. The Marines watching them could hardly believe it. They had watched men disappear under machine gun fire. They had watched the steel storm tear holes through their formations. And still they came forward. That courage was real, and that was what made the scene so difficult to understand. The Japanese soldiers were not monsters. They were men following a belief system that demanded everything from them. They believed surrender was worse than death. They believed sacrifice had meaning, and now that belief carried them directly into destruction. Nicolau fired another canister round. The gun roared. The steel spread. The charge broke again. By now, the sound had become something he would never forget. Not the explosion, not the rifle fire. The sound afterward. The terrible silence between attacks. The moments when the battlefield stopped moving and everyone waited to see what came next. For the Marines, those moments were almost worse than the fighting, because they had time to think. They could look at what they had done. Then the jungle would come alive again. Another wave, another charge, another decision. Cold, fire, survive. The night seemed endless, but slowly, something changed. The Japanese attack began losing its force. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. The soldiers coming forward were fewer. The gaps between attacks became longer. The confidence that had carried them across the sandbar began to disappear. The myth was breaking. The Japanese soldiers had believed they could not be stopped. Now they were discovering that they could. And once that belief was gone, the charge became something else. Not an unstoppable wave, just men running toward impossible odds. Near dawn, the final attacks came. Thinner, desperate. The Japanese soldiers who moved forward now were no longer attacking with the confidence of an army that expected victory. They were trying to complete a mission that had already failed. Nicolau fired what felt like the final rounds. Miller loaded until there was almost nothing left. The gun continued speaking, until finally, the darkness began to fade. Dawn came slowly over Alligator Creek. The first light revealed what the night had hidden. The battlefield was silent. The sandbar was covered with the remains of the attack. The bodies were arranged in strange patterns across the ground. Curving lines, arcs, the exact shapes created by the canister fire. The weapon had left a map behind, a map written in steel and blood. Nearly 800 Japanese soldiers of the Aichiki detachment were dead. The number later recorded most often was 777. The Marines had survived, but survival did not feel like victory. Captain Hightower walked out onto the battlefield. The gunfire was gone. The screaming was gone. Only the ocean remained. Waves moved gently against the shore as if nothing had happened. That contrast stayed with the men who were there. The peaceful morning, the terrible ground beneath their feet. Sergeant Eddie McCollao sat beside the 37 gun. The barrel was finally cooling. The metal clicked softly as it contracted. A small sound, almost peaceful. But he knew what that gun had done. He had understood the mathematics, the range, the spread, the velocity. But no calculation could explain what it felt like to be the person who fired the shell. Private Miller sat beside him. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. They had done their job. They had saved their position. They had survived. But some victories leave a mark deeper than defeat. Among the Japanese dead was a young soldier who had survived long enough to